nestled deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California. The town of Keddie was once a peaceful retreat, a cluster of rustic cabins surrounded by towering pines and crisp mountain air, the kind of place where everyone knew one another and doors rarely stayed locked. It was small, quiet, and by all appearances, safe. But in April of 1981, that illusion was shattered forever, because on one chilling night, what happened inside Cabin 28 would become one of California's most haunting unsolved crimes, a brutal, senseless act that left behind more questions than answers, and a silence that still hangs heavy over the town more than 40 years later. To understand what happened that night, we have to start at the family who lived there, the Sharps. Glenna Sue Sharp was a 36-year-old single mother of 5. She had moved to Keddie the previous year, hoping to start over after leaving an abusive marriage. She had packed up her kids, John, Sheila, Tina, Rick, and Greg, and driven from Connecticut to California, looking for peace, independence, and a chance to rebuild their lives. The Sharps rented Cabin 28 in the Keddie Resort, a modest wooden structure that stood near the railroad tracks, surrounded by a scattering of other small homes. Life was simple, but by all accounts, Sue made the most of it. She was described as kind, soft-spoken, and fiercely devoted to her children. The family didn't have much, but they had each other, and in a town like Keddie, that was enough. By April 1981, Sue had begun taking business classes at a nearby community college, while her older children attended Quincy Junior and Senior High. The family was making slow but steady progress, rebuilding a sense of normalcy. But in small towns, appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes behind the quiet of the pines, there are whispers, the kind that no one wants to repeat out loud. It was a Saturday night. Sue Sharp was home at Cabin 28 with her 2 youngest boys, Rick, age 10, and Greg, age 5, and their friend, 12-year-old Justin Smart, who lived in the neighboring Cabin 26. Her 14-year-old daughter, Sheila, was staying overnight at a friend's house in the same neighborhood. Her eldest son, 15-year-old John, was out that night with his friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. The night passed quietly, at least from the outside. At around 9 or 10 p.m., witnesses reported seeing John and Dana hitchhiking back to Keddie from Quincy. They were last seen near the Exxon station, along the road that led back toward the cabins. After that, no one knows exactly what happened. Sometime between that night and the early hours of April 12th, something or someone entered Cabin 28. The following morning, April 12, 1981, the small community of Keddie woke up to horror. At around 7:45 a.m., Sheila Sharp returned home. She walked into Cabin 28 and into a nightmare. Inside the living room, the scene was unlike anything she could have imagined. Her mother, Sue Sharp, lay lifeless on the floor. Nearby were the bodies of her brother, John, and his friend, Dana. They had been brutally attacked, beaten, stabbed, and bound with electrical cords and tape. Blood was everywhere, spattered across the walls, the furniture, and the ceiling. The furniture was overturned. The room showed signs of a violent struggle. Whoever had done this had taken their time, methodical, cruel, and deliberate. But amid the horror, there was one shocking discovery. In the small bedroom nearby, the younger boys, Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin, were still alive, unharmed. They had slept through the night, completely unaware of what had happened in the next room. But one person was missing, 12-year-old Tina Sharp. Her bed was empty. Her shoes were gone. And from that moment on, Tina will become the missing piece in one of the most haunting mysteries in American crime history. When police arrived at Cabin 28, they were stunned. Even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. The brutality of the attack suggested personal rage, not a random act of violence. All 3 victims had been bound at the hands and feet with medical tape and extension cords. They had been beaten with a hammer and stabbed with knives, some of which were later found at the scene, others missing entirely. Sue Sharp, the mother, was partially undressed, her injuries the most severe. She had been gagged with her own underwear and covered with a blanket. The 2 boys, John and Dana, were bound together with electrical wire. Dana appeared to have been strangled, possibly with a length of electrical cord found near his neck. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing valuable appeared stolen. It was as if the killer or killers had walked in knowing exactly what they were doing. The disappearance of Tina Sharp immediately escalated the case from a triple homicide to a suspected abduction. Search parties were organized across the surrounding woods. Helicopters, dogs, and volunteers combed the area for days, but there was no sign of Tina. Her disappearance was one of the most haunting aspects of the case. What had happened to her? Had she been taken before or after the murders? And why her specifically? In those early days, police had more questions than answers, and every hour that passed made it less likely Tina was still alive. Plumas County Sheriff's Office quickly launched an investigation, led by Sheriff Doug Thomas. At first, the case seemed promising. They had multiple victims, multiple crime scene elements, and a small community where suspects couldn't hide easily. But almost immediately, things began to fall apart. Crime scene handling was chaotic. Evidence was reportedly lost, contaminated, or never properly logged. Officers allowed volunteers and neighbors to wander in and out of the cabin. Fingerprints were smudged. Footprints were trampled. In a case where every detail mattered, mistakes in those first few hours would echo for decades. The investigation soon focused on 2 men living nearby. Martin Smart, the stepfather Justin Smart, the boy who survived the night, and his close friend John Bo Babade, a drifter with a criminal record who had been staying with the Smart family in Cabin 26. Martin Smart was a Vietnam veteran, known around Keddie for his temper and his troubled marriage. His wife, Marilyn, was friends with Sue Sharp. In fact, Sue had reportedly been advising Marilyn to leave Martin, something that might have created tension between the 2 families. When questioned, both Martin and Bo claimed they had been asleep at the time of the murders. But inconsistencies in their stories quickly emerged. A local bar owner recalled that the 2 men had been at her establishment that night, wearing matching suits and sunglasses. They left around closing time and were never seen again until the next morning. And according to Marilyn Smart, Martin returned home in the early hours with his clothes mysteriously missing. He told her he had cut them up and thrown them away. Still, without physical evidence, police couldn't make an arrest. But behind closed doors, many in Keddie already believed they knew who was responsible. In the weeks that followed, the Sharp family's cabin was sealed off, the surviving children relocated, and Keddie was left in stunned disbelief. The resort, once a modest mountain getaway, became a place of fear, its name synonymous with unspeakable violence. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed the murders were drug-related. Others thought it was personal, revenge, jealousy, or even something more organized. But the truth remained locked inside Cabin 28. For months, the police struggled to make progress. Leads went cold. Witness statements contradicted one another. And then a year passed. No arrests, no answers, no sign of Tina. On April 22, 1984, more than 3 years after murders, a man discovered human remains in the woods near Camp 18, roughly 100 miles from Keddie. The remains were eventually identified as Tina Sharp. She had finally been found, but the discovery only deepened the mystery. Her skull and bones were scattered, with little remaining to indicate how she had died. Near her remains were fragments of clothing consistent with what Tina had been wearing the night she vanished. Whoever took her had transported her miles away from home, into the wilderness, and left her there. Her death confirmed what most already suspected, but it also reopened every wound in the case. By then, the Keddie murders had gone cold, and yet, even in silence, the questions only grew louder. When the world first heard about the murders at Cabin 28, few outside the Sierra Nevada mountains could imagine the level of brutality that had unfolded there. But for those who lived in Keddie, a small, tight-knit community, it wasn't just a crime. It was a wound that never healed. The shock quickly gave way to frustration, because as the weeks turned into months and the months into years, one question lingered over every conversation, every headline, and every sleepless night. How could a crime this savage go unsolved? The answer, as investigators would later uncover, lay not only in the violence of that night, but in the failure of the investigation that followed. From the start, the Plumas County Sheriff's Department struggled to control the crime scene. Cabin 28 had been compromised within hours. Neighbors, volunteers, and even reporters entered the home before the area was properly sealed off. Evidence was moved, contaminated, or lost altogether. A hammer and a knife, both believed to be potential murder weapons, were discovered at the scene, but others mentioned in reports mysteriously disappeared. Blood samples were taken, but many were never processed. Even fingerprints collected from inside the home went unmatched, partly because no one had the resources to compare them properly. The department wasn't equipped to handle something this complex. Keddie had never seen anything remotely close to a triple homicide, let alone one this brutal. What the police needed was precision. What they had was chaos. In the middle of that chaos, there was one potential witness, 12-year-old Justin Smart. He had been asleep in the same house, just down the hall, when the murders occurred. At first, Justin told investigators that he had slept through everything, but weeks later, his story changed. Under hypnosis, Justin described something chilling. He said he dreamed, or maybe remembered, seeing 2 men in the living room with Sue, John, and Dana. One man had long hair and a mustache. The other was clean-cut, wearing glasses. In his account, Sue argued with him before violence erupted. The description eerily matched 2 men who lived just next door, Martin Smart, Justin's stepfather, and his friend John Bo Babade. Justin's statements raised immediate suspicion, but his testimony was treated inconsistently. Some officers believed him. Others dismissed his memories as unreliable due to hypnosis. Still, it was enough to shift the focus of the investigation. Martin Smart had a reputation around Keddie. He was a former cook at the local lodge, a Vietnam veteran, and a man whose temper sometimes got the better of him. He lived with his wife Marilyn and her 2 children, one of whom was Justin, the boy who survived. His friend Bo Babade was an ex-con with ties to organized crime in Chicago. He had moved in with the Smarts just weeks before the murders. Both men were questioned early in the investigation, and both denied involvement. They claimed they had been out drinking that night, but were home and asleep by the time the killings occurred. But their behavior in the days after the murders raised red flags. Marilyn later recalled that Martin burned a pair of shoes in their fireplace shortly after the murders, the same shoes he had worn the night before. He also disposed of his hammer, telling her he had lost it. Years later, in 2016, a hammer matching Martin's description was discovered in a local pond near Keddie. It was heavily rusted, but consistent with the kind of weapon that could have been used in the attacks. If Martin and Bo were innocent, their actions didn't make sense. But at the time, police didn't have the technology or the will to prove otherwise. Not long after the murders, Martin Smart wrote a letter to his estranged wife, Marilyn. In it, he said something deeply unsettling. "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I bought it with 4 lives, you tell me we are through. 4 lives. That number stuck out because only 3 victims were confirmed dead at the time. Tina Sharp's remains wouldn't be discovered until 3 years later. To some, that letter sounded like a confession, but for reasons that remain unclear, the Plumas County Sheriff's Department never treated it as such. The letter was tucked away in the case file, forgotten for decades. There were also whispers about conflict of interest within law enforcement. Sheriff Doug Thomas, the lead investigator, was reportedly friends with Martin Smart. Some believe that relationship may have softened the investigation, that Thomas either overlooked key evidence or didn't pursue Martin aggressively enough. Thomas later denied any wrongdoing. He claimed that Martin and Bo were thoroughly investigated and cleared. But to many, it felt like justice had been compromised before it ever had a chance. As the years went on, theories multiplied. One theory suggested the murders were drug-related, that someone had come to collect on a debt or send a message. Another claimed that Sue Sharp had been targeted personally, either by Martin Smart or someone close to him. Some even believed the crime was connected to a larger cover-up involving local corruption, possibly tied to Bo's alleged connections with organized crime. But none of these theories ever gained enough traction to result in an arrest. Justin Smart's recollection remained the most disturbing clue. In his hypnotic regression, he described Sue trying to protect Tina from one of the men. He said one man struck John with a hammer and another used a knife. He remembered seeing blood, and then Tina being taken out the back door. If true, it meant that Tina had witnessed the murders and was abducted to silence her. That would explain why she vanished while her brothers were spared. But even that horrifying theory couldn't be proven. Justin's statements were never backed by physical evidence. And as he grew older, he stopped speaking publicly about the case altogether. By 1984, after Tina's remains were discovered, the case officially went cold. Cabin 28 was eventually demolished, its walls soaked in blood and memory. The structure was too painful to leave standing. The surviving members of the Sharp family moved away. The town of Keddie itself began to fade, its population dwindling year after year. But the memory of that night and the sense of injustice never left. The case files were boxed up and stored in the Plumas County Evidence Room, collecting dust for decades. It seemed as though the truth would be buried forever, until years later, when a new generation of investigators reopened the file. In 2013, Sheriff Greg Hagwood, who had grown up in Quincy, just a few miles from Keddie, decided it was time to revisit the case. He was joined by Mike Gamberg, a former investigator who had known some of the Sharp children personally. Both men had deep ties to the area. Both believed the case had been mishandled, and both were determined to finally bring answers. The first thing they did was reopen the boxes of evidence, dusty, disorganized, and incomplete. Inside, they found the forgotten letter from Martin Smart. They found photographs of the crime scene, statements that had never been properly followed up, and notes about a missing hammer. They also found something else, a sealed envelope containing a piece of tape with possible DNA. That evidence had never been tested. Technology had come a long way since 1981. Now, with modern forensic tools, there was hope that science might do what human investigation had failed to. The DNA testing revealed trace evidence on some of the items collected from Cabin 28. Although degraded by time, some of the material suggested contact between the victims and possible male suspects. Then, in 2016, that rusted hammer matching Martin Smart's was discovered in a nearby pond, right where he had once lived. It wasn't proof, but it was a clue that aligned with what investigators already suspected. Sheriff Hagwood later stated publicly that he was convinced multiple people were involved in the murders. "We know who did it," he said in an interview, "but we don't have enough to make an arrest." As the reopened investigation continued, a pattern began to emerge. Witnesses from 1981 came forward with stories that had never been officially recorded. Some claimed they'd been ignored. Others said they were too afraid to speak back then. Rumors resurfaced that Sue Sharp may have known something, or someone that made her a target. Some speculated she had discovered criminal activity in the area and was silenced for it. Others believed the motive was much simpler: jealousy, rage, and revenge. Marilyn Smart later stated she believed her ex-husband Martin and his friend Bo were indeed responsible. She said Martin had confessed to his therapist shortly after the murders, a confession that was reportedly relayed to law enforcement but never pursued. If true, it meant authorities had a confession in 1981, and somehow it was ignored. By the mid-2010s, more than 3 decades after the killings, the Keddie case was back in the public eye. Documentaries, podcasts, and online forums reignited interest in what many now viewed as one of America's great investigative failures. But despite renewed attention, the core mystery remained unsolved. Who entered Cabin 28 that night? Why were 3 people slaughtered, yet 3 others left alive? Why was Tina taken, and why so far away? And most haunting of all, how could so much evidence be overlooked, lost, or ignored for so long? Keddie is different now. The old resort is mostly abandoned, its cabins falling into decay, swallowed by the forest. But those who remember that night still speak of it with a quiet unease, a scar the town can't erase. Visitors who hike through the area say there's a stillness that lingers. Some call it haunting. Others say it's just grief frozen in time. Because for all the years that have passed, the question that began it all still echoes through those mountains, soft, persistent, and unanswered. What happened in Cabin 28? 40 years is a long time to wait for justice. But in the story of Cabin 28, time hasn't healed anything. It's only deepened the ache. What happened that night in April 1981 isn't just a cold case. It's a mirror reflecting everything that can go wrong when truth is left to decay in silence. When Sheriff Greg Hagwood and investigator Mike Gamberg reopened the file in the 2010s, they weren't chasing ghosts. They were chasing accountability, not just for the killers, but for the system that failed the Sharp family. The first discovery came in a storage locker, boxes of evidence long thought destroyed. Inside were photographs, taped interviews, and small items sealed in outdated plastic bags. Each piece carried the weight of years lost. Gamberg later said, "It felt like the case had been deliberately buried." Among the rediscovered items was a tape containing a 1984 call to the Butte County Sheriff's Office. On it, An anonymous man reported finding Tina Sharp's remains before the discovery had been made public. The call was logged but never investigated. No one had ever traced who that voice belonged to. It was another lost lead, one that might have identified someone directly tied to the killers. Then came the hammer. In 2016, a man exploring the area near Keddie discovered a claw hammer buried in mud beneath a shallow pond. He turned it over to authorities. Gamberg recognized it immediately. It matched the hammer that Martin Smart claimed he had lost back in 1981. The handle was corroded, the metal rusted, but the shape and make were consistent with the murder weapon described in autopsy reports. DNA testing was attempted, but after 35 years submerged, little could be recovered. Still, for Hagwood and Gamberg, it was a confirmation that they were looking in the right place, literally and figuratively. Investigators began revisiting Martin Smart's background. They learned he had a long history of violent outbursts, especially toward women. Friends recalled his bitterness over his failing marriage. Sue Sharp, meanwhile, had been offering Marilyn Smart emotional support and advice, encouraging her to leave Martin. In small communities, that kind of interference can breed resentment. When Martin later moved out of state, he reportedly told a counselor he had hurt Sue. The therapist documented the confession and allegedly contacted law enforcement. Yet, again, the lead went nowhere. To this day, no one has ever explained why. And then there was John Beau Babade, a man whose history was equally troubling. Beau was a convicted bank robber and believed to have ties to Chicago's organized crime circles. He had moved into Keddie only weeks before the murders, bringing with him an air of menace that unsettled the locals. Beau died in 1988, taking whatever he knew to his grave. Martin Smart would follow him decades later. Both men are gone, but neither ever faced charges. For Hagwood and Gamberg, the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the original investigation had been compromised, not by incompetence alone, but by relationships, fear, and perhaps even willful neglect. Documents hinted that both Martin and Beau may have acted as police informants. If true, that could explain the hesitation to pursue them aggressively. Imagine it. A small-town sheriff's department protecting two violent men because they were feeding information on unrelated crimes. It's never been proven, but the possibility hangs over the case like fog over the valley. Every unsolved murder leaves ghosts, not supernatural ones, but human echoes that refuse to fade. Sheila Sharp, the daughter who found her family that morning, rarely speaks publicly about the crime, but when she does, her words carry decades of restrained pain. She once said, "There's no closure because there's no truth." Her younger brothers, Rick and Greg, have lived their adult lives away from the spotlight, carrying memories they were too young to fully understand. Even Justin Smart, the boy who might have seen the killers, has chosen silence. Each survivor bears a different version of that night, fractured by trauma and time. Cabin 28 was demolished in 2004. The land where it stood is now an overgrown patch of forest, the foundation barely visible beneath the weeds. But visitors still come. Some are true crime enthusiasts, others locals paying quiet respects. They describe the area as eerily still, the kind of silence that feels aware of itself. For those who grew up in Keddie, the cabin's absence doesn't erase the horror. It only amplifies it. A void where a home once stood and where innocence was lost forever. Modern forensics offers new hope. Touch DNA, genealogical databases, and advanced profiling have solved older cases than this one. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office continues to retest evidence as technology improves. Partial DNA profiles recovered from tape and ligatures could one day be matched through national databases. But progress is slow. Time has degraded much of the evidence. And without living suspects, even a DNA hit may only tell part of the story. Still, investigators remain optimistic. Each new year brings more sophisticated tools, and sometimes all it takes is one microscopic clue to end a 40-year mystery. Not everyone agrees on what happened. Some locals still believe multiple killers were involved, possibly 3 or more. Others are convinced the crime was a result of personal vengeance, not conspiracy. There's even speculation that Tina's abduction was the work of someone other than the primary attackers, a separate act of cruelty layered onto the original violence. Theories swirl through online forums and documentaries, each one claiming to be closer to the truth. But like the forest surrounding Keddie, every path seems to circle back on itself. For those who lived through it, the Keddie murders changed how they saw their town, their neighbors, even their own sense of safety. Before 1981, doors stayed unlocked. Children roamed freely. Afterward, Keddie became a place of shadows, a town defined not by its mountains or its history, but by the one night that tore it apart. Decades later, older residents still hesitate to speak about it, not because they've forgotten, but because they haven't. The Keddie Cabin Murders are often compared to infamous unsolved crimes like the Black Dahlia or the Zodiac killings. Cases where truth feels just within reach, but never quite attainable. They remind us that sometimes justice isn't a single revelation. It's a process, one that unfolds slowly, painfully, across generations. Each document rediscovered, each DNA test completed, each survivor's story preserved brings the case closer to clarity. But until that final link is proven, the murders at Cabin 28 remain what they have always been: a riddle of violence, silence, and human failure. Most of the original suspects are gone, but there are still a few names whispered among locals, people who might have known, might have helped, or might still be alive with the truth. Sheriff Hagwood and Gamberg have never released all of their findings. Some of the evidence remains sealed, a choice they say is necessary to protect the integrity of the investigation. It suggests that even now, after 4 decades, the case isn't truly closed. Somewhere out there, the answers might still exist, perhaps in a memory, a hidden document, or a long-buried conscience waiting to surface. What makes the Keddie case so haunting isn't just the brutality. It's the vacuum left behind, the absence of certainty, the lingering doubt that the real story was known all along, but never told. In the stillness of the Sierra Nevada woods, the cabin may be gone, but its silence speaks volumes. It speaks of corruption, of innocence lost, of the families forever marked by that night. And it reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries aren't about monsters in the dark. They're about the ordinary people who commit unimaginable acts and the institutions that fail to stop them. Today, Keddie is barely more than a memory, a ghost town of cabins swallowed by pine and time. But if you stand where Cabin 28 once stood, you can still hear the faint hum of the railroad, the wind through the trees, the echoes of laughter that once filled the air. And then, if you listen closer, you might sense the silence that followed. The silence of 3 lives taken, 1 stolen, and a truth still waiting to be found. The Keddie Cabin Murders are not a legend. They are a lesson, a reminder that evil doesn't always vanish with time. Sometimes it just waits for someone brave enough to look for it again. The case remains unsolved, the questions unending. What do you think really happened inside Cabin 28? If you found this story as fascinating and unsettling as we did, Don't forget to subscribe for more deep investigations into mysteries that still haunt our world today. Your support helps us keep these stories alive, and maybe one day closer to the truth.